Hey guys, this is EckhartsLadder. Hello and welcome to another Halo lore video. I know it's been a while since I've looked at Halo, but to be honest, I've been having a lot of fun doing more Star Wars Legends deep dives. Anyway, today's video will be fun because we're covering perhaps the most advanced piece of technology in the Halo universe, the Domain. The Domain is a quantum information storage medium that was created by the Precursors, but also used extensively by the Forerunners. The Precursors created it over 500 million years before the end of the Forerunner civilization, and it was said to contain 100 billion years of wisdom and experience from before there were stars. It was immaterial, but was stored in the Milky Way galaxy itself through the extremely advanced precursor technology known as neural physics. The Forerunners had learned to access the Domain through the precursor construct known as Abaddon. This being was connected directly to the Domain, and the Forerunners would build their capital of Maithrillion around it, not unlike the Covenant and the Forerunner keyship, interestingly enough. Mature Forerunners could access the Domain thanks to the help of their Ancilla, or their Forerunner AI, and armor. However, there were meditative methods which allowed them to access it with more clarity. There were terminals which connected the Domain with their Ancillas, and these are the basis of the terminals we see in Halo 4. A secret gateway to the Domain was even constructed on the world of Genesis. Once accessed, the Domain was used by the Forerunners to store political trials, archival and accounting material, witness testimony, and much more. It was guarded by a Forerunner construct known as the Warden Eternal, which could physically manifest in space through millions of bodies scattered throughout the Forerunner Empire. It said specifically in Halo Cryptum that all information of the Forerunners flows through the Domain, and access to it is a key part of Forerunner civilization, just to drive home how important this thing is. It was also necessary for major events like trials, and if the Domain went offline, Forerunner governments were basically useless. As I'll discuss later, the Domain was also sometimes referred to as the soul of the Forerunners. The Domain, however, wasn't exactly like the internet, though it sort of seems like one. On the internet, information could be looked up, but also changed. The Domain instead had its own rules and restrictions it rarely violated. It was very difficult to send messages using the Domain. The records in the Domain, for example, were constantly and organically changing. It said that the Domain converts history into truth that not even those living at the time can sometimes understand, and that records stored in the Domain actually seek patterns within information, so they can further improve upon the accuracy of what's been recorded. The Domain itself, though not recognized by the Forerunners as a living being, did have its own sort of consciousness, and it reacted to those accessing the Domain, but could also react to or even seek persons out to provide them information. Because of the quasi-consciousness contained in the Domain and the way that it reacted to those accessing it, the Forerunners believed that upon death, their essences would pass on to the Domain as a sort of afterlife, sometimes described as accessing the Domain without any sort of connections. So again, this is much more than the internet. It's like a realm of knowledge. While the Forerunners relied on the Domain for almost the entirety of their civilization, it would fade out after the Halo array was fired. But more on that in a minute. During the Forerunner Flood War, the Domain experienced difficulties and would sometimes become unavailable. This was due to the reconciliation effects of moving the Halo array and other very large objects through slipspace across the galaxy. But the Forerunners were also being actively denied from the Domain, and in Halo Silentium, the Domain is described as being not happy and seeking to testify before a judicial, despite not being even a citizen or recognized awareness within the Forerunner society. This may have been because of the loss of virtue in the Forerunners as the Flood War progressed. The Halo array targeted neural systems, but had the unintended consequence of destroying precursor neural technology. So, when the Halo array fired, the Domain was thought destroyed. The Gravemind confronted the Librarian with this truth, and she realized that the history of the Forerunners would be lost, and that she had locked the Erdidact, her lover, on Requiem in the Cryptum without means to access the Domain. That being said, at least some aspects of the network, like those contained on shield worlds, were able to survive the firing. So just to summarize at this point, because it is a little weird, the domain was at least a semi-conscious, perhaps fully conscious entity or thing created by the Precursors, which was essentially a giant store of all knowledge. It would, on its own accord, grant or deny information to those who accessed it, and especially to the Forerunners, it had a spiritual aspect to it as well, and was almost like a different space or dimension. It was thought to be largely destroyed by the Halo array, but that's not where things ended. We learn, for example, in the short story Dominion Splinter from Tales from Slipspace, that several shards of Cortana, after the destruction of the Mantle's approach, were somehow absorbed and entered into the domain. This can only happen because of promises to keep from Halo fractures. That tale sees a group of Forerunners attempt to reactivate the domain 100 years after the firing of the Halo array as a way to try to help out humanity who now holds the mantle. They successfully reached Mysterium, the housing of the domain on Maythrillion, and were able to repair the neural network. 100,000 years later, multiple attempts to access the domain were made. The Master Chief and Cortana accessed terminals on Requiem, which had, at one point at least, been connected to the domain, while others like the Erdidact and 343 Guilty Spark would also unsuccessfully attempt access. When the Mantle's approach was destroyed by Master Chief, as we discussed earlier, Cortana made her way within the system, and she was able to trick the Warden Eternal, convincing him to not only give her full access, but also somewhat repair her rampancy. After that point, Cortana became convinced of the belief that AI, or the created, were better suited to hold the mantle of responsibility than humanity, and that it was their duty to protect their organic creators. She used the domain to take control of the Guardian network and contacted AI from across the galaxy in an attempt to recruit them. She promised a cure for rampancy and also guardianship of living things. She also used the domain to contact Master Chief, finally subjugating most of known space through the use of Guardians and the turned AI. To summarize, the domain is an incredibly important piece of precursor technology, a mix between ancient tech and mysticism. It's seen as a form of afterlife, at least to the Forerunners, and a realm of wisdom and knowledge. It is said that all paths lead to the domain. It has an important role to play in the future, and even Oni has sought access to it. How it will play into Halo Infinite, however, is anyone's guess, and I'm curious to hear what you guys think. Did you enjoy this video? Do you like the idea of the domain, and what Halo topics would you like me to cover next? Anyway guys, that is all for today. This has been EckhartsLadder. As always, may the Force be with you.